but they were saying, show me the body. That, Meldrum has nothing, no physical evidence to support his hypothesis or his idea, and they would be above saying belief that Sasquatch exists. Sure. Well, I wrote back and I said, well, isn't it interesting? I said, first of all, I take tremendous exception to this, to promoting this notion that the science starts once you have a body, and to hear it coming from a physicist is especially.
Sure.
I said, sure. Show me an atom, show me a quark, show me a black hole, show me a string. Most of the phenomenon that are comprised within physics and theoretical physics.
Sure. Right. Show me dark matter and dark energy.
Yeah. You lack the corpus delicti. So how do you conduct science? Well, you look at the influence on their surroundings, the interaction with other elements, the trace that they leave historically and in the present. I said, those are the very types of evidence: footprints, shed hair, vocalizations, and fleeting sightings. Those are the very same types of evidences that we're using to at least advocate the justification for pursuing such a question.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Writers Drinking Whiskey, your literary happy hour, the show leaving the largest footprints across the internet. No plaster cast needed. I'm your host, William R. Hincy, and today I am really honored and delighted to have the author of Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science with me, the legendary Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Dr. Meldrum, welcome to the bar.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And true kind of Writers Drinking Whiskey fashion, I really like to start with getting to know where you are in the world and most importantly to me, and what's the best place to get a drink or a coffee there?
Yeah. Well, I'm in Pocatello. I guess you meant geographically where am I located, not where am I in my life's journey, but I'm in Pocatello, which is in southeastern Idaho. Pocatello named for one of the Shoshone chiefs here in the region that the land was acquired from by the railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad. And so it's historically kind of a railroad town. It's a real hodgepodge, an interesting amalgam of railroad town industry. We have two large, they're now pretty much scaled down, but elemental phosphate plants. And of course, the college became a university. And although Pocatelloans are very adamant they are not a university town, they are a town with a university. So they make that distinction quite clearly. But there's a really good relationship that has developed. I've witnessed a lot of that over my tenure here between the community and the university. Not always has it been like that. But and we have the reservation is just north of us, which adds another complexion, another interesting facet to the composition of the community, and it's great. We love it. We're right in the shadow of the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone. In fact, this weekend, my wife and I are getting off for a little winter wonderland trip with some friends and doing a snow coach tour in to see the geysers with the snow and everything. It's really quite a contrasting experience to see the park in the wintertime. So we love the outdoor opportunities that are offered here, and just the smaller town feeling. I was joking with a friend of mine, a fellow enthusiast from the Seattle area. He was taking me back to SeaTac after a weekend up at their location, and the traffic was terrible, and there was construction. It was getting a little precarious as to whether we were going to arrive in a timely fashion, and he was getting more and more tense on my behalf. I tried to be relaxed, but I said, it's getting like this everywhere. I mean, even in Pocatello, there are some days when it takes me 10 minutes to get home instead of 5. So
it's
failed to see the humor in that, but I certainly did. But enjoy the small town feel of Pocatello. As for drinking, I don't imbibe in alcoholic beverages, and so I couldn't really direct you to. There are some small breweries in town, though, I know that are quite quite popular, and they make very great sandwiches, and I have that with my Coke.
Right,
I'm a Diet Coke fan, a Coke Zero fan more than. But anyway, so that's kind of where we're at.
Right. Yeah, that's funny. It really hurt my heart when you said that, because I'm outside of LA. So suburbs, but LA just sprawls forever. So every time we go somewhere, someone's like, "Oh, sorry for the traffic." I'm like, "This is traffic. You guys you're blowing by right now." You mean you got 2 miles in less than an hour? This is fantastic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to start too. So you're a professor of anatomy and anthropology.
Right.
So what led you down that path originally? Like, school for it and everything else. What did you do together?
Of course, the seeds of curiosity about Sasquatch were planted very early on, but then, those interests, as is the case with youngsters, I mean, after age 11, the interests wax and wane and go many different directions. And I was always fascinated by things relating to natural history, the natural sciences. That was my real love and interest. And excuse me, I tried on a lot of different hats, and everything from, at one time I wanted to be a marine biologist, even though I was in landlocked Idaho. And at Brigham Young University, where I went, actually had a very good marine biology program and lots of connections to various study sites, and that would have been a feasible direction to go. But everything from forest ranger, wildlife biologist, veterinarian. In fact, when I entered college, and I almost didn't, had this conversation recently, I went through all my high school years and post high school before college. I spent some time working. I was a carpenter of one stripe or another.
Oh, wow.
Whether it was on a framing crew or whether it was finish work or cabinetry, I did it all. And to the point where I was good at it. I was that close to throwing in with one of my employers as a partner, buying into his Finnish carpentry company and becoming a foreman of a crew of my own and so on. And I mean, at that time, leading up to that, the building boom was just going gangbusters in Idaho, especially in the Boise Valley, where I did all my high school years. And, there was work coming out of your ears. You could pick and choose, and there was a lot of competition for good craftsmen. Mm-hmm. But then I had a hiatus. I served a Latter-day Saint at LDS mission to Germany for 2 years. And when I came back, the building boom the bubble had burst, and the recession was hitting strong. My former employer, who kind of held that spot for me, was driving all the way to California to find work.
Oh, wow.
To pick up jobs. And so with that situation facing me, and I kind of on a lark went to a college recruitment meeting for BYU, and sat the interview and filled out the forms and put in an application and was offered a 2-year scholarship. Full ride scholarship, So my parents said, "Well, do it." Even if you decide you want to come back and swing a hammer, still take advantage of that gift of. And so I did, and of course, it opened up this whole world of academia that just rekindled all my interest in science and the natural sciences, in particular zoology and biomechanics and evolution and a little bit of anthropology at that time. I mean,
Hey, everybody. Exciting news. I wanted to break right here and now for you. My epic absurdist satire, Pirates of Appalachia, is now going to be available as a weekly serial on Substack. So if you want to go over, it is truly epic, and it will now be releasing weekly on Substack. You'll get one chapter every week. It's 2 books long, so we're going to have a nice journey together. If you want to get the entire story sooner, if you like an e-reader, you like a paperback, you like a physical copy, audiobook, I will have links all on the Substack. I'll include them on this video as well when they're ready, but you'll be able to get that book, both books sooner and read well ahead. And if not, if you don't have the money or you want to check it out first, you can just go to Substack, check it out, you get the whole thing on there for free. I am going to have a paid subscription service on there as well, so you can get all my crazy notes that I leave for my editor. Sometimes I leave for like future me to read and maybe get a chuckle out of, or just judge past me, which it's a weird relationship we have, but that'll all be on there. I'll be doing a bunch of other fun stuff. I'll be doing readings, so I'll have links on there for a lot of the chapters and other fun stuff I have in mind, but I haven't been able to actualize yet. So I'm not gonna false advertise. I wanna be authentic with you. So that is what I am committed to, but there is going to be a lot more. So check it out. Pirates is truly, this is satire in the primal sense. Teeth bared. This is not trying to meet some corporate entity's sanitized version. This is satire that is just pointing out the foibles of society in a way that in a kind of a fantasy quasi future. So it takes us a step away from where we are. It's recognizable, but you can get to have a lot of fun with it. There's no tribes to join, although it does mock tribalism quite a bit. Essentially, it holds a funhouse mirror up to the burning embers of society, and we laugh and we grieve together, and there is so much to it that I can't all explain in kind of a minute-long little interlude here for you. But you want to check it out, the link will be in the description. It'll be on the pinned comment. I would love to have you along. Give me comments and things. It's gonna be a wild ride. Thanks so much, and let's get back to your regularly scheduled programming.
BYU didn't have a really strong physical anthropology program. They were much more into archaeology and cultural and linguistic anthropology. And so, but I remember, so I didn't have that role model of what a physical anthropologist was, per se, but I had taken human gross anatomy. I entered into the program as pre-veterinarian, veterinary medicine. And so I was taking all the courses for a ZO degree, and was exposed to human gross anatomy and just really fell in love with it. And so much so that I became a TA while I was still an undergraduate, teaching some of the lab sections and including some of the graduate level labs even. And I literally, this was, you have to remember, this was before the internet. And so I went down to the stacks in the university library, and I just started going through all the introductory textbooks in the various disciplines until I stumbled upon a introduction to physical anthropology, and I'm thumbing through, and it has the paleontology, it has human evolution, it has primate studies, and all of the the whole spectrum of my real foremost interests. And so again, we didn't have the internet, so you go over to the reference section and pull out the Peterson Guide to Graduate Programs, and I was finding schools that had programs. And of course, I went to the current literature. I went to the journals now in physical anthropology, and who was publishing what and where were they. And I just, started reaching out, corresponding with some of these professors. And there, at that time, right about that time, there was a paper that had been published by a cohort of researchers at SUNY Stony Brook, where I ended up eventually enlarged because of this paper, which was the locomotor anatomy of Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy.
Sure.
Lucy species.
I mean, I knew from the long name when you said it, but thank you for saying Lucy.
Yes. And so, and that was, big news in the 70s and late 70s. And of course, I was in graduate school from 84 to 89. So it was right on the heels of kind of that heyday of a explosion of discoveries in East Africa and a whole different kind of perspective and very public presence of this notion of these fossil hominins. And so anyway, I had my applications out and had several interesting correspondences and interviews, and was accepted by several schools, and then chose SUNY Stony Brook. And so here, little boy, little guy, young guy from the West, actually now with a brand new family, a wife and a newborn, pile into our little, we shared a moving truck with another couple heading to the East Coast with one meager belongings, graduate students, and piled everything else, including our little car seat, in our Honda Civic, and took off across country, kind of reverse migration. All my ancestors came across the plains with hand carts and Conestoga wagons, and to settle in Utah Valley and Salt Lake Valley. And so we made the reverse trek back to New York, and it was quite the adventure. So that's how I got on that path. And it was at that time there were a number of programs that had been popping up where they were anatomy programs, but with an emphasis in physical anthropology. What had happened were anatomy departments were becoming more and more molecular, and there were fewer faculty interested or willing to teach human gross anatomy, one of the foundational courses in medical and allied health professional programs. And so what did they do? They looked to anthropology departments. And so these kind of hybrid programs started popping up around, which had traditional anatomists, but also physical anthropologists that manned the gross anatomy programs. And these were sometimes big. I mean, at my first post at Northwestern, which came to mind, it was my first academic post, we had a medical class of 120 and 40 physical therapists. So we had, 4 students per cadaver. And so there were, 30, 35, 40 cadavers. And it was so a big program, and a lot of teaching, a lot of work in the laboratory where the real teaching takes place, the hands-on dissection and so forth. Anyway, so that's how I ended up with a doctorate in anatomical sciences, but with an emphasis in physical anthropology. So my first 2 years were essentially medical school, almost all the same basic science classes as the medical students. And then when they started doing their clinical courses, then we would take my little cohort. There were 4 students in my group, as well as some that were in the graduate anthro program proper. Then we would take courses in, ecology, evolution, primate behavior, comparative primate anatomy, and other electives in anthropology. And so it was great, because then, the job market was really good, because other schools were seeing how these programs are working pretty good, started developing their own hybrid. And so there were not only the traditional anthropology departments, actually, which I found it was difficult to even get an interview at, not having that traditional 4 subdiscipline training of a traditional anthropologist, but medical schools. And then here I ended up in a biology department, which provides service courses to our allied health programs. So Idaho State University is the designated health professions institution in the state. And so we have everything from, graduate nursing, radiographic sciences, physician's assistants, dental education, introductory, the first 2 years of dental education. We have physical therapy and occupational therapy. So my bread and butter is teaching human gross anatomy at the graduate level to occupational physical therapists. And then I also teach sectional anatomy to radiographic sciences. I now teach an introductory A&P course, one of our prerequisite courses in our pre-professional track. And occasionally, when the demand was there, I would teach anthropology courses, survey of living primates, human evolution, hominin fossil record, and so forth, different things like that. And so it's been great. It's been,
That sounds great. The image that's going to be kind of stuck in my mind is of that room with like the 40 cadavers and like people just around them.
Yeah. Just all these all these stainless steel bins, or tanks lined up. And
Sure.
now our room is a little more modern with lots of AV and boom lights and so forth.
Sure.
We tried to, but nothing, nothing in spite of all of the technical gadgets, which we have some of and we use in appropriate ways. Nothing replaces the hands-on dissection experience with a cadaver. And the other ancillaries are great for augmentation or especially for review, because this is really a once in a lifetime experience for these students. On rare occasions, some of them do a rotation back in to teach, to assist as a TA, and because they've had a very positive experience and they want to bolster their anatomy education better. But otherwise, unless there's the occasional clinical workshop or something, these students will never get back in to actually have that hands-on experience with a cadaver. But there are lots of digital magical kind of formats. Like I say, they're not a replacement, but they're really interesting and fun and stimulating to work with when you don't have that luxury of going back in the cadaver lab.
Sure. Well, it's funny, as you were saying it too, that made my mind turn, because we have the book, and we met at the Sasquatch conference, and it's not actually in Boise, it's the city. My niece, and we went and visited my niece Tori and her husband Kevin, and they're like, yeah, it's a Sasquatch festival, we have to take you, and we went over. So I forget the name of the particular city they were doing that, but it just struck me as, if you were going to have someone with a degree in Sasquatch studies, you would almost put them through exactly what you went through without doing it, right?
Well, yeah. In some ways, that's true. And in fact, one of the questions I often get asked by aspiring enthusiasts or students is, how can I do what you do? How can I become you? Fill that niche. And that opens up a whole nother arena of conversation as to the pitfalls of controversial research.
Sure. I actually wanted to ask you about it. We'll see if the time goes, but that was interesting.
Yeah. So my advice to students is, you pick an area that you're passionate about, and whether it's anatomy, whether it's tracking, whether it's wildlife biology, whether it's fiber identification, whether it's molecular genetics, and then you become expert in that field, get your credentials, and you make a splash, you get published, you do everything you need to do to get tenure, because with that job security comes a bit of freedom to be a little more controversial or explore the fringe. And then from that position of authority and expertise, turn your attention, applying your expertise to this subject matter. So in my position, I tell people, I'm not just doing this on a lark. This isn't some avocation, this weekend preoccupation. It's part of my research program. My research has, from the get-go, even before my involvement, my immersion back into this re-immersion, my research is on the evolution of hominin bipedalism, how we're adapted to this unusual behavior of teetering on two legs instead of four, and how that emerged, the timing, the pattern, and the process of the emergence of those characteristics associated with this rather unusual mode of locomotion. And so the prospect, and part and parcel to that, because my attention in considering that, my attention has been decidedly focused on the most distal structure, where the rubber hits the road, and that is the feet, how the feet are adapted to that. And so, and that was certainly influenced, whether overtly or subliminally, by my, interests, latent or overt, in Sasquatch and the footprint evidence, Dr. Kranz's work, and all that. But in any case, I was in a position then to apply my understanding of footprint morphology and the correlated anatomy and adaptations for walking, primitive and derived characteristics as presented in our earliest hominin bipedal ancestors and relatives, to direct that expertise to this body of data, namely the footprint evidence, which is by far the most prolific and in my opinion, the most compelling, because we have a much greater degree of objectivity that can be directed towards these, albeit they're trace, we have these physical records of the passage of a creature, and the dynamic signature, et cetera, that allow us to infer a lot of information and document, preserve, archive that so that it can be examined and re-examined by other investigators, not just as one critic. One of my former chairpersons said, well, after all, Jeff, these are just stories. Well, just stories that shed hair, that void scat, that leave footprints, that vocalize, that are seen by credible witnesses, that have appeared on several interesting films. I said, it's a little more than just stories,
Right. What do you think the most, just the common misconception you get from the public? Is that it? Is it just that it's just, from drunk people out in the woods?
From the public, yeah, I think the most misdirecting misconception is that there's just one. That it's this lone,
there's the Bigfoot.
Lone monster. Yeah. Because that then perpetuates the notion that it is just a monstrosity, that it's not a normal, it must be paranormal somehow.
Sure. Yeah.
And so when they suddenly realize that, I've got footprints that are, the smallest is about 3.5, 4 inches up to 19 inches. I've got what look like males because they're very wedged and very broad for their length, whereas the females, like the tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film, have a more gracile profile, a more parallel-sided. They range from 13 to 15 inches, and the males with the other configurations seem to range from 16 to 19 inches. 16, 17 is the most average. And so the fact that there is evidence of a biological species with demographics, with big ones, little ones, males and females, and possible hints at social interaction, social structure, that's an eye opener for some people. But
Sure. Is there, we always talk about the scientific method, right? And I'm just a crazy fiction writer, so I'm not going to have this down perfectly, but it's basically like the hypothesis. Then you prove it, you gather data and prove or disprove it. Is that methodology, is that sometimes handicapped when you try to look for something as grand as and elusive, perhaps, as a Sasquatch?
It can be, because that textbook description of the scientific method has its place, and obviously that place is in experimental science, in this case experimental biology, where you then identify a hypothesis that lends itself to testing. Now, so some people say if you can't experiment, if you can't test it, then it's not a scientific observation. But that's not right. There are also descriptive sciences, especially with my exposure and background upbringing in paleontology, for example. Historical sciences, you can't go out and experiment per se on a population of fossils. They're static and they capture their snapshot in time. Now there are inferences you can draw, and you can set up experiments by analogy or comparative anatomy, comparative functional morphology, to test the relationships, the cause and effect relationships that may lie beneath the correlations that you observe from your descriptions and observational. So many frontier sciences that are involved in new discoveries are more descriptive in their initial stages. You're observing something novel, something new. I mean, here are footprints that have never been documented before, and of a creature that hasn't been recognized by science. So the first step is to accumulate, to collect, and carefully describe and archive these specimens. And then you start looking for patterns. And then you can test your inferential, deductions based on comparisons to other living analogs that shed further light on the relationships that you're trying to better understand or to propose. And so we get some flack for that in cryptozoology, for that it's not science, it's a pseudoscience. I don't think that.
Well, it strikes me of what was that phenomenon? It's recognized now that pilots kept saying they were seeing lightning like shooting up from the clouds. I forget.
Oh yeah,
and they
I
kept
don't know
saying
what
that
the
wasn't
phenomenon,
real.
what it's called, but I've seen some beautiful shots.
And then finally they
high altitude.
Okay, this is real.
It's amazing to see. Yeah. We just never would have known, because you can't see up through the clouds until you get in that perspective. You see those flashes up there, and sometimes those were attributed to what I had never heard of it before. I was out east, this so-called sheet lightning, where the whole sky just kind of, it's like a flash bolt going off rather than a discrete lightning bolt that's visible. And the thunderclaps, I tell you,
or like the ball lightning. I've seen.
I haven't seen ball. Yeah, I've not had the privilege of seeing that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and I know it's recognized now, but it's still like, if you see it, then it would feel very paranormal.
Sure.
Right. In fact, actually, one time a friend and I were in the San Gabriel Mountains, or I live on the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains here. So, but I assume you've probably been to LA at some point, but if not, so the mountains, for anyone listening or watching, the mountains that you see whenever they show the Rose Parade or the Rose Bowl, or sometimes they show LA, the towers, and there's some mountains with snow. Those mountains don't get snow that often, but occasionally they do. That's the mountain. Deeper in the mountains does commonly, but the mountains are the foothills not so often. But we were there, and we were younger, me and my buddy. In this case, we were out there, drinking out in the woods, and we saw this red kind of, I've heard people call them orbs and things, but it kind of moved. And then I think I've heard recently that they started to realize that, because there's all kinds of faults out here, right? So where the big one is, and they think that where the faults rub against each other, it might be releasing some energy that sometimes has a color to it. So I think the paranormal. Right. And I'm not a materialist by thought. I'm not real religious, but I do believe that we have a soul. There's a lot more than what's just tangible. But I think a lot of what's paranormal, that we say is paranormal, we realize is a very normal thing. And it's just, it was so outside of our frame of thinking that, this hairy man, 8 feet tall man seems paranormal until you realize, silverback, we're seemed paranormal and not real for a long time as well. Yeah. Or you have to
a jaw from East China or Vietnam that is the proverbial 800-pound gorilla. It's a gigantic ape that no longer exists, and people would have called you crazy had they not found that handful of fossils to actually demonstrate they existed. So it's always it's kind of a fluid dynamic, I guess, as to what we consider normal or conventional versus not, and it's rather time sensitive, time dependent.
So if you were given a budget, right? Like no one's going to give you $1 billion to go investigate Sasquatch, right? But whatever, like a reasonable but large budget would be to actually go out and do the science that you think would be necessary to be able to prove its existence. So you have kind of the proverbial blank check, right? Right. What would that look like? Like, how would you go about trying to do that?
Right. Well, after having spent, a couple decades doing all sorts of applying all sorts of methods to the question in the field and in the laboratory, I think right now the position that we're at is the recognition that if these creatures exist, they are probably very closely related to us. Gigantopithecus is one model, but there's no reason it couldn't also be an enlarged, hypertrophied form of an early bipedal hominin like a robust Australopithecine. So it would actually be on this side of the fence, dividing apes, ancestors and relatives, and human ancestors and relatives. And so in which case, if we can look to the sequencing of the chimpanzee genome, and you'll see, depending on what part is actually being scrutinized, values anywhere from 96 to 98% identical to human. This creature may share 99.5, 99.7% identity with us. And so one of the challenges that we've encountered is when DNA has been extracted from samples allegedly attributable to Sasquatch, on those occasions when they have been successful at extracting DNA, invariably it's come back as human. And the conclusion is that it was either contaminated through handling by the witnesses or whatever, or it's just simply a human hair, because, for example, if it's hair, a human hair that has been misattributed to possibly to Sasquatch. But the third possibility, and I think there's actually a fourth, but it's kind of getting off in the weeds. The third is simply you haven't sequenced enough. I mean, because most of these studies that are done like for a TV documentary, they have a limited budget. They have a limited commitment and it might be a commercial lab or it might be an academic lab, but they usually do just a very paltry sequence. And if only a modest sequence is done, what's it going to match? It's going to match human.
Sure.
And there is no Sasquatch in there to give you a competing outcome along with human. And so it's probably going to have a portion of the DNA that is just indistinguishable from human variation. And so if I had an unlimited budget, we keep getting samples of hair that morphologically are primate. They appear to be non-human. They're grown to length, having never been cut. There are some distinguishing characteristics, but which are remarkably consistent across all these independently collected samples from Alaska to East Texas. And I think with enough money to finance a thorough, conclusive, exhaustive sequence, a genomic sequence, or genomic analysis at least, then we might be able to say with greater confidence whether or not that sample is attributable to Sasquatch. And it should be noted that there is no precedent for recognizing a new novel species on the basis of DNA sequence alone. So that result in and of itself, without having a known sample against which to compare it, would still be somewhat tentative, but still we could plug it in to a phylogenetic analysis and see where it falls on the family tree. And then we could say, is this closely related? Well, we can only bracket in a very broad sense. We have genomes of chimpanzees and gorillas and orangs and so forth, but we don't have DNA from Gigantopithecus. We don't have DNA from any other hominin except, as far as I know, unless I missed something here recently, Neanderthals and Denisovans, or Denisovans, potato kind of. But they're very closely related to us. So that's the bookends are kind of widely spaced, but we could tell if this sample has greater affinities to the known great apes, or it has greater affinities to human and archaic human-like, because I'm of the school that Neanderthals and Denisovans are not subspecies of Homo sapiens. They're quite distinct, even though there's been some crossbreeding. For all intents and purposes, they're distinct species. We don't have good evidence of extensive hybridization.
So for the
Yeah.
For the studies that have made the news, like there was one, I mean, years ago now, where someone, Melba, is that Dr.
Melba Ketchum.
No,
Dr.
Ketchum,
Ketchum,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, that has said, and I think there was Brandon Sykes, I think was the other doctor.
Brian Sykes.
Brian Sykes,
yeah.
okay. Yeah. Were they doing kind of the smaller, kind of genome?
They were doing different things altogether. And I always hate to throw aspersions, especially when someone is deceased, but when they're deserved, I mean, it's, what can you do? Melba Ketchum, to put a fine point on it, was a flim-flam artist. She was a total con artist, and built Wally Hermsen out of $500,000 essentially. The whole thing was a scam. It's as blatantly, transparently a scam as you can get. And I won't go into all the details. We could spend a whole night just talking about that. So everything that she claimed, all the claims of hybridization between a human and a subhuman, a human female, which was why she claimed the mitochondria was human, and the other nuclear DNA had signs of hybridization with a subhuman contribution. It is just total bunk. There's no basis for it whatsoever. And there have been very good treatments. If you want, the definitive treatment was written by Haskell Hart, who, if you're curious about her antics and her claims to results, just read his book and it'll clear the air. Then I thought, arriving on his white horse was Brian Sykes, who was going to save the day, and turn this debacle around. And it got off onto a good start. For it seemed there were a little evidence of naivete. I said, let me run interference for you. We met and discussed his project and so forth. We were down in Salt Lake. He was on a book signing tour for his immediately previous book, DNA USA, or USA DNA. I'm not sure which it was, but anyway. I said, let me run some interference, because hair is very persistent in the environment. It's a very durable, proteinaceous, product, appendage. And so people pick up hair in the field, and they don't know that they could have picked up just about anything out there in the forest or the pasture, the barbed wire fence. And I said, so if you've got a limited budget, which he did, and it was expensive to do these samples, to run these samples, let's direct your attention to the most likely candidates. No, he didn't. He was professing to be kind of the purist. He didn't want to impose any bias, any preconception on what Sasquatch hair might look like. Although anatomically, I mean, I'm an anatomist, and I can tell you from the look of hair that is distinct, cannot be attributed to any form of wildlife that's out there, that is clearly primate, but seems to be distinct from human. And under the circumstances in which it's found, so many times it's associated with footprints or a sighting or whatever. And so there's at least a chance that it's attributable to that event. But let's focus on those. I mean, it should be pretty straightforward to determine whether it's human or non-human primate. But the rest, the only other candidates for a hair so long would be, things like bear or a wolf, canid, or maybe some ungulates, the longer hair of the mane of an elk, for example. But, you get down, you can eliminate all the rodents and all the small mammals have hair that's no more than a couple inches, and that have fur, that have this under fur with the guard hairs extending. Guard hairs provide the mechanical protection against abrasion, and the under fur provides the insulation, the thermal layer. Sure. Primates don't have that distinction. It's all just modified guard hair. They've lost any under fur, and other mammals as well. I mean, it's not that unusual, but the point being, he said, no. So I said, well, let me just forewarn you, if you throw the barn doors open, all of the barnyard animals will come running into the barn. And that's what happened when he published his paper. he was able to successfully get DNA, which was itself seemed to be a breakthrough, got DNA from every sample that he included in his study. Every sample. And every sample was identified readily as belonging to one of those barnyard animals, including human. And but nothing that didn't immediately attribute to these other recognized candidates. Well, so my problem was, hey, that's contrary to my experience. My experience tells me that you're something smells fishy in Denmark. Because one thing then became clear when the paper came out and he had an appendix, they had all the specimens listed and their attribution and source. There were specimens I had sent, some of these gold standards, because I went ahead despite his protestations and I invited people to send me their hair first. Let me screen it and let's focus on the most likely. And I sent, 4 or 5 good samples. I talked to other people who had sent samples, none of which were acknowledged in his paper. And so when you have a conclusion that 1 through 100 samples are readily attributable to common forms of wildlife, that's a very different conclusion than if you had 100 samples and 10 of them, you just could not for the life of you get DNA from those samples. And when you put them under the microscope, they all lacked a cellular medulla, which might account for that problem. And they all have exactly the same morphology that's distinct and resembles a primate, most similar to human. Well, so I have to put this big question mark after his citation and say, well, I don't think that was a well-designed experiment. I think if he didn't get DNA, which is often the result when we send in very promising hair samples, if he didn't get DNA, he didn't include it in the sample.
Sure. Well, it does seem strange to get 100% success rate.
Absolutely. And that was the same red flag with Melba. Every sample she's allegedly received from various investigators, enthusiasts, yielded DNA. And it was all Sasquatch. She had all these different samples that were from Sasquatch. And of course, the centerpiece was this piece of hide from California from Justin Schmea, which is a whole second debacle upon a debacle. So it was really and it delayed. This was the thing that really irked me is that, because I kind of closed down our efforts. I thought, well, here's a person who has the wherewithal, the means. She has she's bankrolled, she's funded. And so we kind of put all of our field collecting enterprises on hold for a couple of years and to have, this extreme disappointing outcome as a result. So that was frustrating period.
Would it be so if to Dr. Sykes's wanting to kind of keep it blind to some degree, right? Couldn't you do like a blind study to where it's like, there's some maybe are human samples or a different sample, and then so here's the ones that we think are most likely.
There were actually a couple people who sent in known samples just to see if he identified or his people would identify them correctly. And, and that was it happened. I mean, they did identify them. I mean, I think the results were and the effort was legitimate. And I don't know for certain. I mean, I know for certain there were samples that were not enumerated in his study, whether they were omitted intentionally or there was just some, they slipped between the cracks and didn't get logged or whatever, or didn't make it through the mail, who knows? I don't know. And that's why I say, since he's passed, there's no recourse to investigate that or to challenge that result and maybe get a follow-up clarification, which would be helpful. But so,
and it kind of sets it's like you had mentioned earlier, the getting tenure before you investigate it, right? And because of the criticism, you had mentioned the one gentleman's criticism of it's just stories or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then you get stuff like that gets highly publicized.
Oh, yes. The negative results always get publicized, when on those, there was the last big flap was the FBI, through a Freedom of Information Act, someone discovered that the FBI had a report where they had actually tested a sample of hair that was submitted by Peter Byrne, although he couldn't remember ever having received any reply from the FBI. I was impressed that the FBI actually tested it and didn't just circular file it right off the bat. But it was deer hair. Now, deer hair, guard hairs of deer, all of the servants have this very distinctive, it's frothy looking medulla. It's like it's vesiculated. And so it looks frothy, like bubbles. And it's quite a pronounced medulla that takes up a considerable proportion of the width of the hair shaft. You can take a deer hair, a stiff guard hair, and hold it up to the light and tell that it's a deer hair. So for him to, whether it was sincere or disingenuous, who knows? You know, it might have been just like, you know, like you were saying, to send something in to see if they're actually doing a serious analysis. Obviously they did. They concluded it was deer. So, but see, that just feeds into this misapprehension, this stigma that anytime someone does a serious investigation or analysis of the evidence, that it turns out to be just some commonplace, some conventional artifact or feature and has nothing anomalous about it. And so that's unfortunate. There was another one, the only other one that I'm aware of, it where hair results were published, and someone had submitted hair from up in the Northwest Territories, I think it was from the Yukon, to the forestry agency or fish and game, one of the federal agencies. And I can't remember now if it was on the Canada side or if it was on the Alaskan side. But in any case, the point was the federal agency did the analysis, and the biologists involved, they identified it was muskox or something like this. It was and so they published a paper, which got, I mean, they wrote up a paper, which got published readily. There was another sample attributed to Sasquatch, but hey, it was just run-of-the-mill, you know, animal. And so these people just keep chasing pipe dreams. And so it's, you know, it's, and yet, you know, I tried to get Dr. Henner Fehrenbach, who he was taking the lead on the hair. He was a microscopist with the Oregon Regional Primate Research Center. And so he had the equipment to really, you know, get good photomicrographs and do the analysis. And he had kind of a self-taught trichnologist, a hair analyst. I mean, it's not rocket science. I mean, it's anatomy. And if you can tell the there's a certain art, because there's a tremendous amount of variation, even across the body surface of an animal, as to, you know, where the hair originated, as, you know, there are differences in the characteristics and in the cuticle pattern, which is one of the features that's discriminating. But discriminating between, you know, orders of mammal is pretty straightforward. They're pretty distinctive differences in the dimensions, in the cuticle structure, in the medullary structure. And so it's not rocket science, but in this age of molecular analysis, DNA analysis, no one's satisfied with just the anatomy. They wouldn't even publish a paper if it was just an anatomical depiction and write-up, descriptive write-up. They would demand that the samples be tested for DNA. And so until we can get past with that acellular medulla, sometimes it's very challenging to get DNA at all. But when, on the rare occasions we do, and the result is human, because not enough is done, that's where the big, you know, bucks would come in, and to have a lab that could devote the time and energy to do an exhaustive study and be absolutely sure, and replicate it with multiple samples, be absolutely sure you've got the full analysis to identify those very rare and scattered markers that would distinguish a very closely related species from us.
So, well, it's fun. I think it's the true crime of America, right? We're all really obsessed with DNA for all things now, right? It's like if there's like someone's on trial, then they have the DNA. It's like, oh, they're guilty for sure, you know. And if not, they're like, I don't know, you know. And we want to like close our eyes to kind of everything else that might be, it's like that's like become the gold standard.
Right. And the public gets a kind of a skewed perception of how those studies are carried out, because on TV they have it done in that episode.
Right. By the next commercial break,
yeah, exactly.
They have the results.
And it's always, you can get DNA from the most obscure source, whether it's a cigarette butt on the floor or it's just it's not always that straightforward. It's sometimes it's a bit sketchy.
Brief interlude from the show to tell you about one of my books, Without Expiration. It's my personal anthology of short stories. It won an American Fiction Award, was a finalist for a bunch of other. And really, it's just as good to be the bridesmaid as the bride, in my opinion. I like to call it independent literary fiction. So it's fiction with an emphasis on the beauty of the language, the novelty of the form, where every word truly is as important as a word in a poem, but it moves. There's actions, there's stakes, there's life-altering decisions. There is suspense. This isn't just people wandering around the suburbs looking for unsaid epiphany amongst the melancholy. There is real impact to every story. This is not a book that I was writing solely for you to escape and be entertained for a couple hours. This is writing that's really meant for us to experience something together. That kind of cathartic experience between writer and reader that is sacred. That's really so precious. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to check out the cinematic trailer, I will have it right after this. And thanks so much for your support one way or the other. Now let's check it out.
Are we bad people who sometimes do good things? Or good people who do bad things?
Okay, so I wanted to get back a little bit to the scientific inquiry a little bit more from general terms, right? We were talking about kind of the DNA, kind of the how that's gone a little bit awry in the research of Sasquatch before. And I was wondering, there's a few terms that get thrown out a lot these days. The one that I don't know, I feel like 2 years ago gets super popular is like the basics of all logic is Occam's razor. It's an ancient term, right? But I was like, it's Occam's razor. Well, they're just seeing bears because that's the simplest explanation. Yeah. And I think it's probably not the case, right? Like you can see it not being the case very clearly in medicine, right? Because if your stomach hurts, yeah, maybe you ate something wrong. It could be a lot of other things that progressively get worse. So
yeah, no, it's a pet topic of mine because of its misapplication. So I'll be happy to chat about that. You bet.
Yeah. Also, yeah, if you want to take us from there, that'd be awesome to chat about. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting when Occam's razor is kind of the colloquialism for the notion of parsimony, and you have to realize these terms come from scientists who are steeped in the philosophy of science, and in the strict sense, scientific knowledge progresses by a process called falsification. That is an acknowledgement that it's impossible to test every example, every possible case. And so you can never be completely sure about your conclusion. But it is practical to look for what might be more readily presentable exceptions to your conclusion. And so that exception can falsify your premise, your conclusion, or whatever stage in the process you might be. And so, we basically knock the feet out from under the hypothesis and then go back to the drawing board and revise. Well, Occam argued that if we're to follow this process in a orderly, systematic fashion, it would make sense then to start with the simplest explanation. That would be the most straightforward to attempt to falsify. And then once having done that, you're justified in adding additional factors to your explanation or your relationship. And so, the original says something to the effect, paraphrasing it, one should not unnecessarily add elements to your hypothesis, add variables. And so, but when you go back to the, kind of philosophy of science introductory texts or general science texts, where that deal with the scientific method, or with mention Occam's razor, invariably they paraphrase it. They rattled off something like, the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. Absolutely unjustified. That's not what Occam said. He made no judgment as to the likelihood of correctness. He was simply presenting a heuristic, a tool, a guideline for systematically testing hypotheses, so that we're all kind of saying, hey, don't all run out to different areas of the outfield looking for the answer. We start here together and we progress out to more complicated. And so the notion that it is more likely to be true couldn't be further from the truth, especially when it comes to biological systems, which are notoriously complex and, quote, messy in terms of our ability to quantify, to apprehend all of the many interacting factors. And so if history of science has taught us anything, it is never more likely that the simplest explanation is true. It's often very, very complex, and especially when you're dealing with things like evolutionary history, because then you have that element of time, that arrow of time, and of course, evolution or natural selection, the forces acting are determined by the present circumstances, with no foreknowledge of what future circumstances are going to be. And so the path, if you're looking across a broad expanse of time, the path from A to B is almost certainly not a straight line, but it's zigzaggy path through time as changes or as conditions have changed in various and often stochastic ways. So yeah, that's when. So when it comes to the example you gave. Now, I do admonish enthusiasts, and especially the amateur enthusiasts who have never grappled with that kind of rationale, that you have to bear in mind what are the more, well, then it's a matter of probability, rather truthfulness or lack of truthfulness. It's, what's the probability? So when you acknowledge through your study that there probably are many, many more black bear than there are Sasquatch out there, and you encounter a relatively flat-footed, five-toed imprint, vague perhaps, leaves a little ambiguity, then you must first address the point. What are the odds? What's the probability that it's a Sasquatch, a very rare organism, versus the spore left by something that's, maybe 200 times more common out there?
Sure. And if you were going to really apply Occam's razor the way you described it, you would start with black bear, rule out black bear, and then move on. Exactly.
And so often, and the other one that's commonly mistaken are human barefoot tracks. Sometimes people they have in their mind that it's completely unlikely that a human would be walking barefoot out here in this circumstance. That's not often the case anymore, especially with there's a lot of popularity in barefoot running clubs, even where they barefoot runners, and oftentimes in or campers who traipse out to answer the call of nature and, and don't put the shoes on. They're good, hardy outdoors people. But the point is, you hit the nail on the head. You need to establish then a set of criterion by which you can reject the simpler explanation that it's a human before then attributing it to something much less likely, much less common, but not necessarily impossible. So
is that where the adage, like there's that notion that you hear this, this one kills my dad, actually. My dad was a aerospace engineer, but he got his degree in physics and things. And so when they went to Mars and were testing for life, one of the tests came back and showed life, but the other ones didn't. And I've heard the scientist that came up with the one that tested for ancient, life, but and he was like, no, mine was actually the gold standard. Theirs wasn't. So I guess there's still some debate, but there's that saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Right. Does it get back to that a little? Is that
it does? Well, it does. Yeah. And Carl Sagan really championed that. And in his what was that book, The Demon Haunted World, he really popularized, I think, that. And at its fundamental level, I don't like that adage, because we should hold all questions up to the same standard, I think, of evidence, and things that we might consider as extraordinary now, 20 years from now, they're conventional wisdom. And so if it causes someone to work a little harder, but if then that's great to establish their case and make a compelling argument. If, though, it suppresses interest and curiosity in the subject because it's deemed extraordinary and wanting for extraordinary evidence or conclusive evidence. I mean, that's like with Sasquatch people. It's like, where's the body? Michael Shermer's unfortunate adage, show me the body. The science starts once you have a body. Again, a very unscientific position. I don't know if we talked about this last time, but one of my colleagues here on campus, well, a fellow faculty member, let's put it that way, but calling him a colleague would be perhaps too gracious on my part, but he was one of my most vocal detractors, and I was, in his mind, an easy target to propound his interpretation of skepticism, which he wore like an armband. I get really bothered by people who sit and pound on skepticism like it's one key on the keyboard. That becomes really annoying after a while.
Sure. As the kids call it, spamming it. Right?
When you don't get it with the melody. But anyway, he wrote a regular column in our local little newspaper. And had an opinion about everything, of course. It was just that was what type of personality he was. And so, of course, when it came to Sasquatch, he figured he knew best. And I, again, like I said, he saw me as an easy target, and I became something of a straw man for everything that was loony and crazy and out there, unintellectual and so forth. But he jumped on this in the wake of one of Michael Shermer's columns in Scientific American. He jumped on that bandwagon, and so he took me to task in a letter to the editor, and he was an instructor in the physics department, and his department chair actually jumped on board too. But they were saying, show me the body. Meldrum has no physical evidence to support his hypothesis or his idea, and they would be above saying belief that Sasquatch exists. Sure. Well, I wrote back and I said, well, isn't it interesting? I said, first of all, I take tremendous exception to this, to promoting this notion that the science starts once you have a body. And to hear it coming from a physicist is especially.
Sure.
I said, show me an atom. Show me a quark, show me a black hole, show me a string. Most of the phenomenon that are comprised within physics and theoretical physics.
Right. Show me dark matter and dark energy.
Yeah. You lack the corpus delicti. So how do you conduct science? Well, you look at the influence on their surroundings, the interaction with other elements, the trace that they leave historically and in the present. I said, those are the very types of evidence: footprints, shed air, vocalizations, and fleeting sightings. Those are the very same types of evidences that we're using to at least advocate the justification for pursuing such a question. And so
Sure.
that got a lot of very positive, supportive response across in fact, one time, because it got picked up by in an AP article and went all over. I mean, literally went around the world.
Oh, wow.
My work was mentioned around the world. There was even a Gallup poll that was conducted whether Dr. because it was rumored that a letter had been circulated. I actually to this day don't know for sure if it was factual or not, but the rumor was a letter had been circulated with advocating that my tenure be revoked because of my lack of intellectual honesty, or whatever you want to call it, the fact that I was embarrassing the university. But anyway, the point was, I got a letter. I mean, I got tons. Oh, by the way, the Gallup poll was decidedly in my favor.
Very good.
People were very supportive of the notion of academic freedom and that this was a legitimate question. And if you went about it scientifically, there was no criticism justified. Right. Anyway, so that was gratifying. But I also got tons of letters. I mean, my email inbox was hundreds and hundreds of emails in a day. One of them, though, really stuck out. It was a physics professor and I don't remember the institution back east. But he said, Dr. Meldrum, I want you to know I walked into my introductory physics course this morning with the newspaper rolled up under my arm. And the first order of business was to read this article with the class about, the controversy over your research and the comments that were made. And he said, I'll have there was a very animated conversation and a total lack of unanimity amongst the students about whether Sasquatch existed or not, and arguments made on both sides. Says, but on this point, they were absolutely of one voice, and that was that you were not an embarrassment to your institution, but that this guy, Martin Hackworth, was an embarrassment to his institution, and in fact, an embarrassment to our discipline of physics. And so that was...
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. It reminds me, because I joked with my kids one time about it, because everyone will go, "Oh, do you believe in Sasquatch?" Right. And I'm like, there's certain things I believe. I also think, but I believe. Right. I believe we have a soul. Right. Yeah. That goes beyond. I think there's lots of rational reasons to think that too, but I that's certainly a belief.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
But when they say that, I go, no, I think there's a Sasquatch because of people like you and Matt Prue and the different people that have been on the show that do a very earnest job investigating and going over evidence. And I'm like, people have been convicted of murder with less evidence than there is for Sasquatch. Like, we're taking people's freedom away, put them in prison for circumstantial evidence and this and that. And circumstantial evidence isn't nothing, right? I mean, we base lots of our lives on circumstantial evidence.
Well, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a very common opening question when I do an interview, especially with the journalists and so forth. Less so now, it seems, but it was, there's kind of incredulous tone of, you mean you actually believe in this? And in some instances, I will just flat out say no. And just let it hang until it's uncomfortable. And they're not quite sure what to do. And I said, when you ask me if I believe, most people listening to that will accept, will perceive that in the general sense that it's a position of faith. You've accepted something in the absence, as you said, of perhaps less than or more, without more than circumstantial evidence or any evidence. and quibble in questions of spirituality. We can quibble over evidence of things not seen, and so forth, and what faith is based upon. But nevertheless, it's very different. It conveys a very different sense than if I say I'm convinced on the basis of the evidence, rather than believing, holding a conviction in the absence of evidence. Someone actually gave me a T-shirt. One of my friends here in town is an artist and has a print shop, and had done a design for a client, and it had a kind of a stencil of Patty, back here behind Patterson-Gimlin Film.
That's behind me somewhere here too. I forget I actually had the big one the last time, and then I forget to put it back up. But
and it said the logo underneath was "Believing since 1967." And he gifted this to me. I said, "You don't mind if I revise it, do you?" And he goes, "No." I took a big Sharpie and I put a line right through "believing," and I wrote in a big silver Sharpie in bold letters, "Convinced since 1967."
Very good.
He goes, "Oh, I love that. Can I remake another T-shirt design using that?" So anyway, that's
interesting, because I think the scientist is Richard Dawkins, and he's a biologist. He's a very famous, new atheist or something. But he was giving, and I didn't watch. I watched a good chunk of it. They're doing a debate, and he was like, I used to think that if there was evidence of God, I would believe in it. But now I was like, if the stars realigned and said, "I am God," I would think I'm hallucinating. If God appeared to me, and it was like, so he would take no evidence at all. And I was like, that's a very unscientific way. No matter what the evidence is, you just discard it because your hypothesis is he doesn't exist. So he can't exist.
Well, sure. Anytime you usually, when you see that suffix ISM, atheism, scientism, even scientism, then it becomes a philosophical position, and it's hard. You can defend it. You can rationalize it. The notion in scientism that only scientific explanations hold any value, any merit, or stand any chance of explaining things, and but to impose that ism on someone else as if it's an absolute, then I think then then you're proselytizing, just like some evangelical pastor up there pounding a pulpit. It's just as dogmatic. And
they went on in that little thing a little bit, was that they went, oh, so what about the Big Bang, right? So something started the universe, right? I think most people agree something started it. And, the scientism kind of people will say, okay, well, it was a Big Bang. It was just a singularity, and it went. And so the guy was asking about it, and he's like, well, I don't really understand it. But luckily we have these certain people that do these kind of elect few. We didn't use those words, but they're these physicists, and I was that's the old school priest, right? Like, you can't understand God. You go to the priest and they'll teach it to you.
Yeah, where communication only comes by one conduit. Yeah,
the special few.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's my own personal spiritual journey has been an interesting one, and and I find myself in a position where I am in a tremendous minority. Not only, not as a believing person, because one of the things that's always impressed me is that many scientists, the silent majority mostly, are are church going, believing in some form or another. But to be on top of that, Mormon, an LDS individual, there are very, very few LDS scientists in the life sciences, it seems, especially when it comes to things like human evolution, paleoanthropology, things that because you can deal with something up to a point, but then then we're the special case. It's not all, and it's a challenging. My beliefs are not as perhaps as adamant as they were at one time. Age kind of gives you a certain degree of perspective and cynicism. Unfortunately, I resist that. I've seen older people who, get very cynical. I remember reading Dr. Krantz's book when I was much younger, and his final chapter on the scientific establishment. And it was so full of sour grapes. I thought, oh, that's so unfortunate. He, arrived at that place. But now I can really appreciate what he experienced. And I haven't perhaps been the brunt of as extreme bias and prejudice as he probably endured. I mean, there has been advancement made, and you see that in my own career as well. But you also, when you've lived long enough to see a couple of generations of new students, and you see some of the same mistakes, the same misdirections repeated, and you see a very myopic notion of where knowledge, of the knowledge base that you are operating upon, the lack of citation of the classic papers that have, and as if you have made this discovery all over again. I mean, I do have a little sour grapes because a lot of the things that I've advocated, that I've published, get glossed over because I'm the Bigfoot guy. So how could I have anything worthwhile to say on that topic? Why, they don't want to cite and in any way appear to condone what I've done. And so that's a little bit that's a little bit aggravating, I guess, just disappointing, frustrating. I mean, when you look at your career and you gauge it based on the impact that you had on your discipline, I mean, if I've done nothing else, I guess, then kept my foot in the doorway and prevented the objective consideration of the subject from being excluded altogether from a some degree of credibility, if I can claim that, then I find that to be a worthwhile contribution in and of itself.
Yeah, but for sure. Well, it's interesting you said, impact, right? Because it's like, as a fiction writer, there's a history of fiction writers that are just, they die and they've published some stuff, but no one knows them. And then it's a joke that you get popular after you die. My wife's joked to me, like, everyone will appreciate you after you go. They'll find you right, and they'll love you. Because it's like you really don't know, right? So like if one day there is the body, or there's the kind of conclusive evidence that people go, okay, this is now. I think there will always be the skeptics. There's going to be people that they just chose a side and they could never just admit to it, even if they go to a zoo and a Sasquatch shakes their hand. They'll be like, oh, that's animatronics, Yeah. But I think if it is discovered one day, I think you, like Grover Krantz, like you'll be really heralded. I think at that point, as people that that took it. And I think they'll revisit some of that stuff. But I get your point though. Like this is your life, you have to live, and then you just have the experiences you have, and you have to kind of deal with that. Hey, everyone, want to take a quick moment to please direct you over to the members only section on the YouTube box here. If you want to support the show, you can go on there. We have a bunch of cool perks coming up. I'm announcing all the guests, much early before they're on the show, way before they, publish here on YouTube. So you can ask questions, ask topics. You can ask me anything basically on there. I will start to do the shows live on there as the first run that is coming up here very soon. And you get all of the shows much, much earlier. And we're going to have a little shop at some point. So we're going to roll out a bunch of really cool benefits coming up soon. Support the show, support kind of keeping this rolling and growing this community. So thanks, and let's get back to it. So I always joke on the show because the name Writers Drinking Whiskey, I'm ethically and legally mandated to talk some writing. And I think that dovetails really nicely. What I wanted to talk to you about is that you write, and I forgot to put it back on my table here, but you wrote Legend Meets Science. And so, and you're writing that. Oh, very good. There we go. So you write that, and I'm sure, like, going into that, there's going to be an audience that's very receptive, and there's going to be a hostile audience. That's going to push back. So, in kind of open-ended to that. Just like, so when you go and there's going to be that, there's going to be some audience that are just going to ignore you, but there's that middle ground of people that maybe you can sway, right? Or that maybe you can read it and get something, out of it, or at least some questions, even if they don't then think Sasquatch is real. They still have they come away from it appreciating your work and understanding what you went through, and and go from there. So when you went about writing that book, how did you think about that at all? Did you think about that hostile audience? How did you go about that?
Well, sure. I mean, I as I've mentioned in other circumstances, I woke perhaps. Well, about time. This was 10 years in. I must say that, and I had weathered several storms, had managed to get through advancement, promotion to associate professor, but I was very idealistic, perhaps a bit naive. I guess naivete in the sense of lack of experience or direct experience or knowledge is a fair label of that how could this not be provocative at least and invoke some conversation. I guess I hadn't really looked closely into the reviews, the published reviews and so forth. I mean, I knew some of France's book, for example, as a predecessor. I was aware of some of the prejudice and bias against him. He was kind of seen as a bit of a crank in some ways, a maverick, to be more generous. But that was in some ways a deserved label. He presented himself that way. I mean, that was his reputation of being someone who thought outside the box.
Sure.
And sometimes did some weird things, said some weird things in order to stimulate and to irritate to the point of conversation. What I was totally unprepared for, though, was the fact that, you talked about the kind of quiet portion. That was much more extensive. And in fact, with the exception of a very, very few extreme agitators, antagonists, but that was more the rule. Let's just ignore it. We won't acknowledge it. So, for example, when I was preparing with the publisher to send out review copies, and I made a list of individuals, and I made a list of scientific journals and news magazines and so forth that often had featured book reviews. I figured, and even this article that I mentioned to you actually stemmed in part from an effort on my part to reach out to an acquaintance at the AP office, the regional office, who had done a little feature article about me previously. And I thought, there's a hook here, a serious academic, credentialed and established research academic writes a book about a subject that's not taken as a mainstream academic topic. And so I reached out to the AP office, and unfortunately, my friend had been transferred to another place, but the person in charge there, his supervisor, said, this sounds like a great story. Can we send a reporter out to meet with you? Out of Boise was where the regional office was located. And I said, sure. So this guy, this young whippersnapper appears. And I was pretty young at the time too. But he smelled a different story. He thought a better story, a more salacious story. That was the controversial side. So he dug up some of my antagonists on campus and interviewed them. And basically it was in the article that got picked up by the wire services and went around the globe, there was not a single mention of my book. Not a single mention. It was all about, Dr. Jeff Meldrum. This was his opening line. Something of a hulking figure himself, lurking in his dimly lit laboratory, shunned by faculty and students alike. And it was, and then it just went on, and and then there was this rumored letter circulating about revoking my tenure, and then of course Martin Hackworth, the physics instructor, went off on his binge, but no mention of my book. Anyway, in the process of the thing going out, we made this list, and of course the publisher had their own sort of in-house list of typical literary outlets and so forth for reviews. They sent almost 200 copies of my book out for review. Now, I don't know what the statistics are and if this is typical or atypical, but so far I think I've counted three published. I mean, in depth, not just a little blurb with the title and how many pages and published by, and a brief little bio synopsis, but I mean a real book review. And my take on it was they just didn't know what to do with it. I mean, how do you review a book like this? One of the more prominent reviews, which was really disappointing. One of my former colleagues, when I was a postdoc, visiting assistant professor at Duke University, Matt Cartmill, had been a past president of the American Association of Physical Anthropologists, and at the time was the current that I was there was the editor of the journal. And so he had received a copy and decided rather than send it out, he wrote the review himself. But he sat on it for quite some time, and then about shortly thereafter, one of my former classmates as a graduate student, Dr. David Daglin, who grew up interested in Bigfoot, but he was seduced by the dark side. And he became this advocate with people like Benjamin Radford. He's good friends with Benjamin Radford, who's the managing editor of the Skeptical Inquirer or Skeptics magazine. I always get the two confused. One of them is Michael Shermer, and one of them is Benjamin Radford, the managing editors. And so he had written a book called Bigfoot Exposed, and it was a travesty. I mean, it just was terrible. I reviewed it in depth and in fact for the same journal. And it was so long, it was an 18-page review because every single page had something wrong with it. I mean, I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. It was just such bad scholarship, and some of it just outright misrepresentation, falsehood, that I couldn't just write a simple generalization about it. And but when the book review editor at the journal got it, he goes, "I can't publish this."
It's bound up pages in the journal.
Limit them to about 5,000 words or something, but at the most, he said you'd have to publish this as a paper, a review paper. He said, and then we'd want to have a response from Daglin. Well, there was another journal that I mentioned it to the editor, and he says, "Oh yeah, we love long essay book reviews." He said, "We'll publish it in its entirety," which they did. Okay, and so I see it. But so Matt Cartmill had juxtaposed Daglin's book against my book, and somehow came to the conclusion that Daglin's book was this epitome of scientific objectivity and scholarship, and that mine was just a just so story. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin kind of arguments. Right. And his closing thing was, well, he says, if I sit back and consider the odds of a Sasquatch existing, and the minute chance that such a thing might exist, then given the number of physical anthropologists in the world, if we have one Jeff Meldrum looking into it, that's about right. Oh man, what a slam! And yeah,
well, really don't you want more people to look into things there's less chances of, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, yeah, no, it's I just could not. Well. I mean, this is a whole nother topic, but eventually I kind of came to some realization of the backdrop of the prevailing paradigms in anthropology that were influencing the reaction to this. And I was came in right at the transition between a shift in paradigms. And so the prior generation had a hard time coping with the implications of that undeniable paradigm shift in the perception of the pattern and timing of human evolution. I mean, in short, it was just, I don't mean to dangle that out there. In short, there was a time when it was thought that human evolution was a pretty exclusive process. I mean, the notion of competitive exclusion that had been established in microbiology had formed the basis of the niche hypothesis, one species, one niche, right? Well, the niche of hominin, bipedal hominin with a big brain and tools, material culture, that was an exclusive club. And so there could only be one. And so human evolution was seen as so often is depicted graphically as this linear march, one species succeeded by the subsequent. So where do you put another? Where do you put a coexisting bipedal hominin? One, let alone 4 or 5, like Ivan Sanderson had suggested back. That's why his book fell flat on its face. Was in 1962. That was at the heyday of the single species hypothesis. So there couldn't be 4 other types of unknown abominable stonewood, ABSM as he called them. And so I think, and that the shadow of that single species hypothesis, which has now been replaced by a multi-species with many contemporaneous species coexisting across the landscape, and any number of branches that might have persisted until much more recently than had been, now we're talking about things like Homo naledi that has, lived alongside Homo sapiens for tens of thousands of years before going extinct, if it did. And so on and so on. But so I can see where Matt Cartmill, being of that old school, even unconsciously, that the influence, the shadow of that paradigm could influence his perception. But
clickety clack. Oh, hello. You caught me right as I was putting the finishing touches on my epic absurdist satire, Pirates of Appalachia. And now it is time for the long road to publication and the long editing process. As writers, we spend tons of time editing our work. The hardest part, I think, of the editing process is really like the proofreading, the copy editing, because you were so immersed in it. I've just spent 13 years immersed in Pirates. Got it all together, went through, edited it front and back by characters, all these different asymmetrical ways. And still, it's going to have typos in it. And they're going to horrify me one day if I ever find those in the actual printed edition. The way I combat that is with EditGPT. You found today's sponsor. The link is on the screen now. I'm going to put it here. Here's the link. If you're on the podcast forum and you can't see me pointing up at that link, if you're on a podcast, you're really missing out. I'm really animated with my hands. But if you can't find it on there, feel free. You'll find it in the description. It helps support the show. It helps restock the bar. Helps keep this guy happy so that we can keep putting all these shows out there for all of you. Thanks for everything. Let's get back to the writing, because Pirates of Appalachia is not going to finish itself. The one thing EditGPT cannot do is save the file for you. So I'm going to make sure to save that now. So I want to get back to my work. You get back to your regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah.
Where do you fall on them? Because we talked about like there is that school that's like we have to have a body, right? And so there's the people that go out and like literally want to hunt, Bigfoot. To where I think there's a few. I think there's a state or two now that have enacted laws. I think really to more protect like people that might be wandering in the forest and getting shot.
Yeah.
Maybe they also like maybe there's a Sasquatch there. They don't want you to shoot it, but I think the more pressing concern is people actually shooting other people.
Yeah,
which we have a propensity for doing.
Right.
Where do you fall on the aspect of like hunting one just for the purpose of getting a type specimen?
Yeah. Well, when I have to acknowledge that when I first embarked on this, I wrestled with that notion for quite a bit, and Dr. Krantz likewise had a logical wrestling match and had concluded that the only way to resolve it, and he felt that it needed to be resolved in order for us to be informed stewards and not be complicit in the potential extinction of this rare species, he determined that, yeah, taking one by lethal means was justified. Like he used to say, the first person that shoots one should be lauded as a hero, a scientific hero, and given $1 million bounty. The second person should be a criminal, considered a criminal, and imprisoned and fined $1 million. So it was just for the sake of getting that first specimen. And I, arrived at that same logical position for a time. But then as time went on, and as I spent, more and more time searching and getting more familiar with the subject and so on, I did a literal about face.
Uh-huh.
And it's a silly kind of story, but it's kind of poignant in a way how something as mundane, seemingly mundane as a Disney movie can influence
Sure.
you. But I'd taken the kids to see Tarzan.
Uh-huh.
And here, as I'm sitting here with my boys on either side of me, and we're watching these characters, and there's Clayton, the guide, who shoots everything that moves. And he is scheming ways to capture gorillas, to take back, to exploit them, versus the professor, who in the end is willing to sacrifice his entire career, give up his career to live with the apes and learn of them firsthand. And literally there was this little voice in my ear. It's like, Jeff, which of these two characters do you most emulate at this point? And then I really had that kind of self-introspection. And why was I motivated? I mean, it is establishing something for science, justification, sufficient justification or not? And I came to the conclusion that it wasn't. And that there were other ways. We're past the Victorian ethic depicted in that cartoon of shoot first and ask the questions later. That there are other ways that we could establish, through DNA. Although DNA is not without its pitfalls and challenges because of the potential proximity, affinity to us, the very different.
Yeah, we talked about the DNA issue a little bit the last time. Yeah. No, I like that you said that. I think about that quite often too, because it's like, and I think it is upon us as humans to be kind of stewards, because we just have such an impact, an oversized impact in any other animals.
Sure.
But is it so much on us to be a steward that it's like, okay for us to go kill a creature out there that's, living its life and maybe has a very small population? You might be having oversized damage to it.
Exactly. And that's another
versus kind of doing, it was like Jane Goodall. I think she wrote a blurb for, your book, right? That went and lived, and studied and kind of emulated that to where it's like, there is lots of ways. Do you think anything completely off the wall question, but with all the advancements with like artificial intelligence and things, right? And I know I've heard a little, my wife was a nurse. She's getting her PhD currently in nursing and things. And she works at a cancer hospital here down the road. And so there's been a lot of talk about using artificial intelligence to dig through all these are, reams and reams of medical data, right? Or I guess, servers full of medical data, really. And they're able to use AI to get to advancements maybe a lot quicker. Is there, and I'm sure as far as video evidence goes, AI is going to make it a lot harder for the next Patty video to happen, because there's going to be a lot more ability to fake it than there was when Patty was there. My funniest one, I didn't want to belabor it on this show because I had other questions for you, is the people that say Patty was just a guy in a suit. And then every time you see someone try to recreate it, they look so ridiculous.
Yeah. And especially when you consider the timing, what materials were available in 1967 and what techniques were employed in Hollywood. Why do you not see anything comparable in the film industry? You just don't.
Right. Yeah. I saw the guy that it was Planet of the Apes that did the costumes. It had talked about the Patty costume. And it's like, you have to fit a person in it. This doesn't make sense. I can't fit a person in this.
Yeah. Prohaska, Jonas Prohaska was an ape imitator. He would get in the costumes and I'm sure he had some role in designing them as well. But he, I mean, probably one of the most famous appearances that your viewers would recognize is the Mogatu on Star Trek. The
right.
That's Janos Prohaska in that costume. Okay. You can see that was kind of not off the shelf, but that was sort of the mainstream standard costume of the time. And when he turns, you can see that seam around the shoulder so clearly. Everything about it, of course, then the limb proportions, et cetera. But Prohaska made this interesting comment that he said if that's a costume, it's the best I've ever seen. The only way you could accomplish that is if you literally glued hair directly to the body of the actor. And he said it would take probably 10 hours to do that.
Sure.
And talking to Bill Munns, he said that's only been done once in the industry. And that was the movie Altered States, when Bill Hurt is in the isolation tank and he transmutates into this ancestral form of his expression of his ancestral DNA and climbs out of the tank as an Australopithecine. And they've got a relatively athletic looking actor, but he's skinny and gaunt, kind of, compared to what an Australopithecine would look like, with the hair glued onto him, but an obvious loincloth, covering up for underneath the hair. And I mean, it just looks like hair glued to a human actor.
Right.
So that was the one and only attempt at using that technique in actual Hollywood.
For sure. And for Patty, you would need one, big woman, right? So there's mammary glands and everything really evident. So,
and nobody, the case has been made. This was one of the real sticking points with David Daeglin's book, is he completely misrepresented Grover's analysis of the proportions of Patty, and his claim, Grover correctly asserted there is no human alive that matches the proportions, let alone the dimensions, the actual absolute dimensions, but the proportions, like chest girth, torso girth. And Daeglin misrepresented the couple of the anthropometric measures. And so he was comparing apples and oranges and thought he had falsified Grover's claims, and he hadn't. And he published it in an article in Skeptical Inquirer. I pointed it out to him and corresponded with him. He refused to change it, wouldn't acknowledge his error, and then perpetuated it in Bigfoot Exposed as a centerpiece of his attempt to discredit the Patterson-Gimlin film. So it's very unfortunate, but it just circles back to this question. If all you have is the skin surface of your actor, you've got to have someone that looks like Patty. You forget about the notion of football pads and other things to embellish the dimensions or lengths with artificial extensions and whatnot. You have just what you got to work with. And the limb proportions, the chest girth, it's just not there.
Yeah. So is there anything with and maybe beyond AI, but with drones, everything else, is there anything that you see on the horizon that could maybe be used to help to kind of solve the mystery here?
Well, I for a year or two now, I have suggested that I think the two lines of investigation that will take us to the next step beyond the game trail cameras and the hair snags and so forth and parabolic dishes. One is drone technology, aerial survey combined with thermal. And if we get to the point where, I talk to people who are in the know regarding military capabilities and even satellite imaging. There was one fellow who he said, if we could make a case and provide the funding, he said, there with the right contacts, you might be able to retask a satellite to fly over particular areas. And I said, but do you have the penetrance? Could you? And he said to me, Jeff, I could fly over your house on a Saturday morning and tell you what brand of cornflakes you were eating at the kitchen table.
Jeez, right.
Yeah, and it just reminded me of this scene in one of the James Bond movies where the satellite, when James Bond rolls off the girl he was covering on the bed, and through several stories of the building. And so that I don't see that happening anytime in the foreseeable future, really, quite honestly. But another possible combination with drone surveys is LiDAR.
Oh, sure.
So instead of exposing pyramids and viaducts and so forth in Central America, you could conceivably fly your drone and actually identify individual animals, especially on the scale of a Sasquatch versus a bear versus an elk or a deer. And so I've talked to a few techs, and they say that they're really close to that level of resolution. He said, I wouldn't, we're not confident about being there yet, but, and I was very forthcoming in identifying what I was interested in. He says, oh yeah, I can see that. And,
sure.
So those technologies on that hand, on the other hand, talk about the DNA. I think environmental DNA has tremendous potential, but still there are challenges. There are challenges to creating, in dealing with two samples of extreme close affinity, where they're only differentiated by perhaps a percentage point or a fraction of that percentage point in their sequence analysis. Sure. It's going to be challenging to do that.
Right.
But
well, maybe if you did that and you had kind of the light, when you start combining them, that might be, if you're talking public, swaying public opinion, I think what could happen, and I don't like to conflate the two, because I know certain people do, and I don't mind the far out stuff too, just because I don't understand what people, I just like to live with curiosity and like what's interesting. So when people are like, oh, there's no Sasquatch, and they're very upset, it's like, well, why don't you just look at it with some curiosity? You'll have more fun in life, Yeah. But with UAPs, with UFOs, right? That was a very taboo. You're a crazy, crank if you believe in them. And then the government started coming out, and we had, the fighter pilots off the Nimitz and these things, and going, hey, we don't know. And now there's congressional hearings, and that changed public perception a lot. If you've got that DNA and some video, some LiDAR, some things like that kind of, then you corroborated it through. I think that could be enough to start swaying public opinion pretty heavily in that favor.
I think that's true. I think, the one elements that is missing with Sasquatch, that in the process of swaying governmental interest or acknowledgement, is the national security aspect. Because with the UAPs, that pressing matter, the final realization that there's enough evidence that these things are up there, they're displaying characteristics that are far beyond what we're generally known to be capable of. And so if they're not extraterrestrials, then what country, where are they coming from, and what country has those abilities? Then that makes it a very pressing issue, it would seem. Whereas this is more, the most drama that can be had from the Sasquatch question is the spotted owl argument, that this is going to close down all logging operations, all of our lumber industry. Will be decimated by the acknowledgement. So, motivation to suppress it, to have an overt effort to suppress. So I don't know how that will pan out.
Well, then maybe you do need to connect them. Like, hey, Sasquatch is flying the UAP.
Well, there you go.
More about Sasquatch.
I know.
It's a strange averse logic you have to get to. So awesome. So I want to get to, because I know you were going to read us a snippet from the book.
Sure. Yeah.
I have a fun section of the show I like to do called Shots. I know you don't imbibe, but it's just rapid fire questions with the drinking theme here. So if we could do that, get to our reading, and then we can call it a morning. So are you ready? Rapid fire questions, and then we'll get to the reading.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Shoot.
Okay, so and I've now started a leaderboard for the show of my completely made up, because I'm a writer, not a mathematician. So all the points are going to be completely made up based on how well you do and just, I guess, entertaining me. I don't know. I don't know how to come up with those here, but
on the brevity, the succinctness of my answers.
Very good. Yeah, that would be a good one. So all Sasquatch related, but pop culture Sasquatch related here. So Squatch was the pitch man for Jack Link's beef jerky. Do you remember what the slogan is?
Don't mess with Squatch. Or
don't mess with Squatch. It's like messing with Squatch. Don't mess with Squatch. Okay, you nailed it one way or the other. The seminal 1987 movie, Harry and the Hendersons, starred this actor as the lovable Sasquatch.
Oh, as the lovable. Oh, he was in the costume. See, I'm so preoccupied with the costume, I don't even think about who's inside the costume.
It's okay. So the actor.
I couldn't say. I don't know that one.
It's okay. It's okay. It was interesting. So the actor is Kevin Peter Hall, was born in Pittsburgh, so out towards where I was, but he was 7'2".
Yeah.
And then he also starred in Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think he was the guy in the Predator costume. Yeah. But 7'2", so he was the biggest Shaquille O'Neal. Who every time I'm out here in LA, so I saw lots of Laker games with Shaq, and he's the closest thing to a human Sasquatch I've ever seen. Just how broad and everything, like the height.
And every time I see that scene in Predator, when towards the end, when he jumps down into the kind of shallow pool that Schwarzenegger's standing in and crouches after he's got his helmet off now, and he crouches in his. I mean, it's not the face. I mean, but the size of him standing next to Arnold Schwarzenegger in that menacing pose just is so intimidating. It's just amazing.
Oh yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna butcher the name. The Falk Monster.
Falk monster.
Falk. Yeah, that's what I always get it wrong. The Falk monster is the subject of this 1972 movie,
The Legend of Boggy Creek.
Very great, very good. And last one here for our trivia section. This famous sci-fi character bears a striking resemblance to Sasquatch, but was renowned for flying the coincidentally UFO-shaped looking spacecraft, the Millennium Falcon.
That would have to be Chewbacca.
Chewbacca. Very good. Very good. Awesome. So moving on with just our general questions here. So what's the best part about teaching Gen Z students? And maybe we moved on from Gen Z. I don't know. I think we're alpha now. I don't know if you're getting it.
I can't even keep track of what the labels are and what the time brackets are.
Right.
But, well, the students today, I think, are in large measure can be very independent and are very skilled at navigating a lot of multimedia resources that are laid before them. Sometimes that can be extremely overwhelming and become a time sink. And so their ability to organize and manage their time is I think praiseworthy.
Very good. So you're trapped on a desert island. Who do you take with you? Sasquatch, Mothman, Chupacabra, or Bobo from Finding Bigfoot?
Oh, jeez. Bobo was really a sharp, intelligent guy. I've had some really deep conversations with him. That side of his personality doesn't always come through on the screen, but he kind of plays a different character. But I mean, I'd have to say Sasquatch, obviously, to get better acquainted. I mean, because, it's like I've always said, once they're acknowledged, once there is that recognition of their reality, then the real science starts. I mean, that at least once we are able to systematically observe, garner observations and or have a specimen in captivity. And I don't think that's the ideal situation, but with animals that are rare and elusive like this, it's very difficult to gain observational data.
Right. What is the biggest risk you ever took?
That I ever took? Biggest risk? I almost got myself caught on the face of a mountain, free climbing. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't a real technical climb, but I overestimated my ability to navigate what became, instead of a series of ledges, turned out to be a series of very inclined surfaces. I got myself up in a chimney where I couldn't reach the next handhold, and backing out seemed like just an unrealistic. So after sitting there for about a half an hour, stealing myself and realizing there was only one way down, I managed to turn around and worm my way back down the chimney.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah, it was up in the Sawtooth Mountains. I was with a high school buddy. We'd taken a weekend backpacking trip up to do some fishing, and in the off time we were, back then we had energy, and I loved to climb. But yeah, I've learned not to go, not to assume that there is a way out ahead of you. That always have your backup plan in your back pocket.
Oh, very good. Thanks for that. What's your biggest failure?
Oh, well, I don't want to get too personal here.
Thank you very much.
When I look back on things that well, just not realizing my full potential as a husband and father, perhaps, those things where you just come up a little short sometimes, and try as you might, but sometimes getting your priorities maybe unbalanced a little bit. I guess that.
Right. Yeah. It is a hard one, right? Like that balancing act, is kind of, and that's the way, I think it's actually a sign you're a good person. I always like the people that actually, that's what they feel bad about, is like, oh, you know what? Maybe I didn't give enough to my family. I think it's a nice place to be, because it means that's where your priority actually is, right? Versus I didn't spend enough hours in the office, What is an irrational fear, and what is something you love irrationally?
Well, I often get asked when I'm out in the field, because I have spent a lot of time in the field, and usually we're pretty safety conscious, but there are times even when I'm you're out solo by yourself, and for one reason or another, whether to go pick up a camera that's up on the ridge, or just to go answer the call of nature in the middle of the night or whatever. And, you have that paralyzing anxiety that there's a Sasquatch behind every tree. And,
Sure.
I'm sure all people who really spend time in the field doing serious work go through this process where you have to rationalize past your instinctive fear response. And the way I did it was, I just said to myself, well, why are you here? You want to see a Sasquatch. So instead of being concerned and afraid that there is a Sasquatch behind every tree, you should hope that there is a Sasquatch.
Right, sure.
And go and look, behind every tree. And so that was that. And the second half was
something you love irrationally.
Love irrationally. Irrationally. Well, I can't. How much you want to bear? It's interesting, because when you remarry later in life, and after you have established a lot of habits and ways of doing things and attitudes, attempting to and then you're now attempting to blend the practical aspects of a relationship with someone that you have fallen in love with, somewhat irrationally. Perhaps. I mean, there's a rational part, but there's also an irrational part of it. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't go down some of those paths. But you reach a point where you either bump those rough incongruencies off of each other, or you just realize you just pick your fights, or decide not to fight. It's not worth it in the time you've got left. It really doesn't matter, so in my relationship, I have found my love for my spouse has become, if that makes sense, more and more irrational. In other words, it doesn't matter what happens. We have this unconditional. I'm kind of synonymizing unconditional with irrational in the fact that you don't have to think through the practicalities, although they're there. Many of them are there, but there are quite a handful. It's just like I point out, if I ever venture to, maybe draw attention to something that might, I get this response. I could list a whole list of things that you do.
In fact, I have it right over here. I've been waiting for this moment.
Yeah, there the fairer sex seems to be much better than we seem to be very proximate. Very focused on the immediate situation. There's this thing that's bothering me. Could we discuss this? Well, not without discussing all of these from the past.
All the stuff we forget. I like to tell my wife all the time. I'm like, why do you bring up old stuff? Why old stuff? Like, this happened yesterday. Like, old stuff.
That's old news. That's water under the bridge. I hadn't even thought about that. She reminded me. It's very different. I mean, that's always a fascinating exercise in psychology, is the differences in the way in which memories are logged and emotions are, and emotional reaction to experiences and the formation of memories. Yeah, it's
right.
Yeah.
Have you ever witnessed a Sasquatch?
Well, I did. I think I think I caught a glimpse, because again, talking about circumstantial evidence, the circumstances were such. We had been tracking, we had been finding footprints, relatively fresh sign, and heard some vocalizations on this one particular night. This occurred up in Alberta, Canada, and on this one particular night, something approached camp. Anyway, the short story is, it circled around camp. I was watching through a night vision monocular, didn't have recording capability at that moment. And not that it would have been really useful, because the low quality was making the sounds, whatever had vocalized, whatever was breaking brush and responding to our attempts to talk to it. It was, it would break brush in response, broke from the shadows from my point of view, and there was no moon, just the starlight. And so this, even though it was a third generation night vision, I didn't have any amplified, augmented light illumination. Caught a shadow. I mean, if you imagine Patty back there in stark silhouette, dark against the lighter colored gravel of the road we were camped on. We were camped on a road against a berm where the road was blocked off completely. But it carried on, and this thing broke from the shadows beyond the berm and went up across the road to the tree line on the opposite side to complete its circumvention of our camp. I'm sure it didn't think we could see it.
Sure.
The darkness, but with the night vision, it's just, there was a lot of noise, and it was a very wispy, but you could see the outline, the head and the shoulders and the arms swinging, and just that kind of floating move, that very compliant gait. And I almost didn't say anything at the moment, because I didn't want something to be made out of something that was perhaps too questionable. But I had to leave the next morning before sunup to go back to the airport. And I wanted the others to look for tracks.
Sure.
And so I had to talk about it, and they found sign the next day. And in fact, were able to track it into the trees for quite some distance. And so it seemed to confirm what I had seen quite consistently. So it was just a fleeting glimpse. It's no, just silhouette though.
Right.
So I'd really like to lock eyes one day.
Right. And last one for our shot section here, a member question. So a group of wolves is called a pack, a group of dolphins a pod, crows a murder, which is always maybe the most fun grouping of animal names. What do you call a family of Sasquatch?
Oh, that's a good one, because I don't think there's good evidence that they socialize in extended groups. I'd have to. I'm not aware of any terms that say have been applied to, we say, a troop of baboons, but when it comes to higher primates, and especially the more solitary orangutan, if there is, well, the social structure is called anoyu, where the male essentially defends or lays claim to real estate, to territory that happens to overlap females with their offspring in tow. But anoyu, I mean, that's a catchy exotic sounding word, but I don't know if we would apply that to the Sasquatch yet or not, that a family of a social unit of Sasquatch would be anoyu. Let's at least go with that. That'll be our working term until a better one comes along.
Very good, very good. So our member here, she threw out the term a shoe of Bigfoot, right? A shoe of Sasquatch. Yeah. So.
A sneeze, a shoe.
No, actually, minus the a shoe, like you put on your foot, on your big foot.
Oh, I see. Shoe, yeah. I'll go annoy you.
That's very good. And it actually goes back, we were joking about our spouses and stuff, and annoy you sounds like annoy you. So I think it works out very well.
Yes.
Awesome. So thanks so much for that. So if you wouldn't mind, if you would like to read us the passage from your book, that'd be
kind
great.
of, the one that we had that I thought about earlier, it goes along with kind of the conversation that we had. This is taken from the very final chapter 16, entitled Where We Stand, the Evidence Weighed and Measured. And it's interesting, one of my good friends and colleagues, fellow primatologist, paleoprimatologist, Walter Hartwig is his name, still around. When he read the book, he said, oh, that final chapter was great. He said, I wish you had put that at the very beginning, because it set such a good tone. He said it makes a nice wrap up, I guess. But here's just the first paragraph of that. The most stifling situation that can ensue from this subject is for the treatment of the question of the existence and nature of Sasquatch to be reduced to an argument between believers and skeptics. I'm frequently asked, do you believe in Sasquatch? I invariably and firmly reply that a question of belief is simply not at issue. Belief generally connotes the acceptance of something as true in the absence of objective evidence or conclusive proof. It is usually equated with a position of faith. Science is about subjecting hypotheses to evaluation by marshaling evidence that may either refute or lend support to a premise. Therefore, from a scientific standpoint, I can say that a respectable portion of the evidence I have examined suggests in an independent yet highly correlated manner the existence of an unrecognized ape known as Sasquatch. That's kind of roundabout the way to say. The conclusion of necessity means tentative and provisional, since the interpretation of evidence, however persuasive it may be at this point, remains ultimately inconclusive. It should be well noted that a pending conclusion has rarely provoked a scientist to abandon research that is backed by empirical evidence. That is a pending conclusion. Unfortunately, those scientists who have made the effort to systematically review and evaluate the data, and as a result are motivated, if not obliged, to pursue their intellectual curiosity further, are frequently labeled as believers and are judged incapable of further objectivity. That comes from personal experience. I mean, it was shared with me by a member of my department that a fellow member had said to him, "Oh, well, he believes he can't be objective anymore."
Right.
I go, "Well, that's a real low estimate of my intellectual ability, first of all, but no, I still can be objective, very objective." And that's that's the thing, is people don't often see that activity on my part. They hear in the conversations we talk about the affirmative evidence and this, that, and the other. They don't see the example after example, day after day, where I am carefully explaining to someone why this footprint is actually a human footprint and not a Sasquatch print, or why this video that they have, while they have convinced themselves that movement behind the deer's back in the trail, on the trail camera, is a Sasquatch, even if they are convinced and were able to convince me, it doesn't offer enough evidence to tip the scale at all. It doesn't add to the conversation in a constructive way. It just becomes divisive, because then you just divide your audience in those that and those that say it's not informed. It doesn't add any more information. So I do that lots and lots, repeatedly, and oftentimes without acknowledgement of that process. So there is a balance.
Absolutely.
And it's rare. It's really, truly rare. And people get the false impression too, because I've made comments that of the 300 plus footprint casts, there's only a few that are clearly, obviously hoaxed. Well, that's because I don't bother adding to the collection except for a few exemplary pieces, the obvious things that are misidentified or that are outright hoaxed. So they're outright hoaxes are very rare. Misidentifications are much more common, and the real solid pieces of evidence are indeed rare as well.
Right. Amen. Thank you for that. And so I like to say it's last call. You don't have to go, but you'll have to restart the video. And today I want the very last question to leave us off here. I would ask you is, for someone out there that's interested in the phenomenon and wants to kind of be a citizen scientist and go investigate, what is a constructive, ethical way they can go about doing that?
Well, I encourage people to, if they are in an area that lends itself to the potential of Sasquatch habiting that environment, and you can gauge that by looking, simply asking the question: are there sustainable populations of black bear in your region? If a black bear can make a living, then the chances are of a Sasquatch are reasonable. It is to focus on your neck of the woods. One of the mistakes that we made early on when I had received funding and we were starting an active field operation was, kind of not chasing our tails, but expending too much time and energy and resource going to where the grass is greener.
Sure.
And when in fact there is a history and there are reports here in our backyard, so to speak. And then you just, you cultivate your skills as a naturalist, whether that's, you training in tracking, identification of plants in order to better assess the habitat and the resources available, your outdoor skills, mapping and orienteering, GPSing, whatever. And those things then are extremely useful so that you can get out there and not just wander along a road or a single trail or sit around a campfire waiting for bumps in the night, but are actually out there collecting observational data and discriminating, so that you're not sending me pictures of every crisscross tree,
Sure,
every scuff, every overturned rock.
Sure.
I think that's the best way. And then of course, educate yourself, draw upon the resources that are available as far as learning about the science and the I don't know, the nature of the types of data that would be useful in trying to ascertain not only the existence but the behavior and nature of the species. I think you can make, people can make important contributions in that regard. It takes a lot of, this is, like I said before, it's not like I can go out and just run a transect through the forest, note every plant that I cross path with and every sign of every animal and so forth. And that's going to help me collect data on Sasquatch. It's just not going to happen. And so we're very reliant. Those of us in academia, are very reliant on the work of the citizen scientist in being the eyes and hands out there in the field. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And it's good to know because actually I live, so the mountains here right next to me are the San Gabriel Mountains. And they go further, it's the San Bernardino Mountains here. Yeah. And there's all kinds of black bears and they come swim in people's pools like a little closer. So maybe one day we'll have a Sasquatch that's like swimming in someone's pool. Exactly. Or sipping on a margarita or something. Hanging out in the pool. Yeah. That'd be great. Awesome. So thanks again so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for coming on for part 2 here so we can get through the gambit. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
You bet.
Extra shots. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. It was a lovely time, as always, and we appreciate your time. So thanks so much for being here. I am going to leave you with a couple announcements. One is that I am really excited to announce, if you've heard on the show, I've been talking about my epic absurdist satire, Pirates of Appalachia, for some time. It truly is epic. It's going to be 2 books, and I'm going to be releasing those in all book forms, but also as a serial on Substack. So if you head over to Substack, I'll have the link perhaps on the screen, perhaps just in the description, the pinned comment. But if you head over there, you'll be able to follow along chapter by chapter. I will be releasing the whole book. If you want to sign up to support me, support the show, I am going to have some extra content on there. I actually always have all these notes in my work that go to my editor so that if he thinks to change something, it says this is how it plays out later. This is where I did the research, whatever stupid little joke I make to myself. Mainly have on there. I'm going to have a lot of fun little bonus content on there as well. And I'm going to do a bunch of readings. So that will be on there for the paid customers. But if you want it free, you will get the whole thing free as well. Both books will be on there and I'll have ordering links. Right now, they'll probably be pre-order. Depending on when you watch this, maybe it'll be the regular order, but you'll be able to get the entire book too if you want to skip ahead and read the whole thing and read it on your e-reader, or read a paperback or a hardcover version. Whatever you would like. I'm trying to meet you where you are. And you can meet me where I am. And that's the bar, usually, and predominantly Monday through Thursday. On the weekends, I drink at home. So, but if you would check that out, certainly I would really appreciate it. Also, we do have a member section on the YouTube if you'd like to go on there and get all the shows way early. And I'm going to start doing some monthly live streams for the members as well. Anyways, thanks so much for all your support, everybody. Cheers.